Let's break down what the best exercises for building muscle are according to the science. Welcome back, Dr. Milo here today with Strong by Science, breaking down the research on what exercises are best for building muscle in your physique. Let me give you the bad news first. And the bad news is that we don't have a ton of studies directly comparing different exercises. If you're not super familiar with exercise science, you might think we have studies comparing the dumbbell fly and the cable fly, and the cable fly to the cable crossover, determining which one is best. And as much as I would love to say that's the case, we just don't have those. Research studies are a ton of work, and so we don't get research studies on every topic ever. However, through the findings in different studies, we're often able to piece them together and create a puzzle that roughly approximates a bad analogy for scientific principles to base our exercise selection off of. But before we come to those, I will discuss the few studies we do actually have comparing individual exercises to see which one tends to be better. And maybe that can tell us something about which exercises more broadly tend to be best for hypertrophy. Throughout my PhD and my whole education and a recent search on the topic, here are all the studies I was able to find comparing different exercises and seeing which one is better for building muscle. First, we have a couple of studies comparing the overhead extension exercise to the cable pushdown, and that's a study by Milo and colleagues and a study by Stasinaki and colleagues. In the study by Milo and colleagues, they found better overall tricep hypertrophy in all three heads doing the overhead extension over the cable pushdown. Conversely, in the Stasinaki study, they compared the overhead extension to the pushdown as well, in a smaller sample size, measuring only tricep long head hypertrophy, broadly finding similar hypertrophy whether participants were doing the cable pushdown or the overhead extension. Specifically, at the more proximal side of measurement, closer to the shoulder, the pushdown had a slight edge. Meanwhile, at the more distal measurement site, closer to the elbow, the overhead extension had a slight edge. And so, when you take these two studies together, overhead extensions are likely the slightly better choice for tricep hypertrophy. And specifically, when you consider the long head of the tricep, it does make sense. In the overhead extension, you're lengthening or stretching that part of the triceps more, which, based on some other research, seems beneficial for hypertrophy. The second comparison we have is a comparison of the incline curl and the preacher curl, and that's a study by Zabalita, Corda, and colleagues. They measured hypertrophy of all the elbow flexor musculature, and generally, at all sites measured, found better hypertrophy in the preacher curl group compared to the incline curl group. Looking a bit more closely at the results, the differences were largest in favor of the preacher curl at the more distal measurement sites, closer to the elbow. And that is another one of the findings from the long versus shorter muscle length training research. In this case, you're comparing an exercise that is most challenging in the lengthened position, but that doesn't place a huge stretch on the target muscle, that is the preacher curl, to an exercise that has a bit more of a stretch, but has less tension in that lengthened position, and that is the incline curl. And based on this study and a couple of other findings, it might be the case that in any exercise that is productive for hypertrophy, we generally want to prioritize both the stretch position and tension, but more specifically tension in that lengthened position over just purely getting a deeper stretch in the muscle. Staying in the upper body now, we have another comparison of the skullcrusher and the bench press exercise by Brandao and colleagues. They looked at a variety of factors, including exercise order, but one of their comparisons in the study was a group that only did skullcrushers to a group that only did the bench press, measuring pectoralis major hypertrophy and tricep hypertrophy. When it came to pectoralis major, or chest growth, the skullcrusher group didn't really grow any muscle. However, the bench press group did, and when you look at the other conditions, it seems like including the bench is the main thing. And then, as far as the triceps are concerned, there were a few findings. First, with regards to the long head, which is a biarticular muscle responsible for both shoulder extension and elbow extension, skullcrushers were far more effective at growing that muscle. Likewise, when it came to the medial head of the triceps, the skullcrusher was a bit more effective than the bench press. And finally, with the lateral head of the triceps, the bench press was slightly more effective than the skullcrusher. Interestingly, there are a few findings we should pay attention to here. Number one, in a biarticular muscle like the long head, we generally want to isolate one of its functions or perform both of its functions at the same time. If we're shortening the target muscle at one joint while lengthening it at the other joint during a compound movement, there's some research suggesting that's not ideal for growth. For example, another study by Kubo and colleagues in the rectus femoris and the hamstrings, both of these muscles experienced this effect during the squat. They also found very poor hypertrophy. And so in biarticular muscles, like the long head of the triceps, a tricep isolation movement is probably a better choice. But specifically, the skullcrusher was better than the bench press for the long head and the medial head, whereas the bench press was better for the lateral head. And in fact, in a group that included both the skullcrusher and the bench press, they saw the best overall tricep hypertrophy. So some variety in your exercise selection is a wise thing to do. Isolation movements tend to work better for biarticular muscles, and different movements might target different areas of a muscle. Next up, we have two studies, one unpublished by our own lab at Lehman College with Brad Schoenfeld, and one published by Kinoshita and colleagues, comparing the seated calf raise to the standing calf raise and measuring gastrocnemius and soleus growth. To make a long story short, the results in both of these studies are very similar. That is to say, standing calf raises lead to more gastrocnemius growth than seated calf raises, and seated calf raises seem to lead to similar, or maybe, if you look very closely, slightly greater growth than standing calf raises in the soleus. But this effect is very marginal if there is one compared to the difference in hypertrophy and the gastroc. So for overall hypertrophy, most if not all of your training should likely just be standing calf raises. There are two potential interpretations for these two studies. The first is that in the standing calf raise, we saw more hypertrophy of the gastroc because it is more stretched in that movement. So in line with other research, it would just be the case that lengthening a muscle more during training is beneficial for hypertrophy. The second interpretation is that during standing calf raises, because the gastrocnemius is a biarticular muscle and you're shortening it at the knee, you're placing it into active insufficiency, reducing its ability to produce tension, and therefore its hypertrophic stimulus. I'm partial to the first interpretation, but take it as you will. Next, we have a couple of studies comparing the Smith machine squat to the leg extension exercise. Broadly speaking, hypertrophy is relatively similar. It leans slightly in favor of the leg extension over the Smith machine squat. Importantly, the results as far as the exact distribution of hypertrophy, like for example whether or not leg extensions are better for the rectus femoris than a squat, are relatively inconsistent between these two studies. So maybe leg extensions are slightly better overall for quad hypertrophy, but it's by a small margin. And importantly, this is in the context of the squat depth being quite limited in both of these studies. So if you're able to squat deeper than participants did in this study, with the stretch being an important factor for hypertrophy, there's a good chance that the squat would be more hypertrophic for the quads overall. Next, we have a study comparing the hip thrust to the squat exercise, which is better for lower body growth. In the study by Plotkin and colleagues, they looked at gluteus hypertrophy, adductor hypertrophy, hamstring hypertrophy, and quadricep hypertrophy. They found similar gluteus hypertrophy, but they found substantially more quadricep hypertrophy and substantially more adductor hypertrophy from the squat compared to the hip thrust. Meanwhile, since the hamstrings are a biarticular muscle, I wouldn't expect them to grow much from either of these exercises, and indeed, the growth in those was relatively small. What this study seems to suggest is that muscle length isn't as important as we thought. So a squat is relatively challenging closer to the stretch position and allows more people to get deeper and get into a deeper stretch for their glutes, whereas the hip thrust is essentially a partial range of motion at shorter muscle lengths and is hardest in that peak squeeze position. So what gives? Well, if you actually look at how deep the participants were squatting, on average, they were squatting a little bit above parallel, so their depth might have been contributing to the results here. So what we can say from this study is that if you're not squatting particularly deep, as far as just the glutes go, the hip thrust and the squat are probably similarly effective for inducing hypertrophy in the glutes. But when it comes to the quads and adductors, the squat has an edge. And neither of these two exercises is particularly effective at hypertrophy in the hamstrings. Next, we have another study by Milo and colleagues that compared the seated leg curl to the lying leg curl. In the seated leg curl, the biarticular hamstrings are more lengthened, whereas in the lying leg curl, the biarticular hamstrings are more shortened. Additionally, they also measured gracilis and sartorius hypertrophy. Specifically, the sartorius is a biarticular muscle that is responsible for hip flexion, the opposite of the hamstrings. So in this case, it was more lengthened during the lying leg curl than the seated leg curl. And just as you'd expect based on the muscle length research I've been mentioning so far, in the seated leg curl they observed more hypertrophy in all three of the biarticular hamstrings than lying leg curl, and in the lying leg curl they observed more hypertrophy of the sartorius muscle than in the seated leg curl. So essentially, across these two exercises, when a muscle was being more stretched, it experienced more growth, and otherwise there were no differences. Because ultimately, both of these things are leg curl variations. Importantly, the range of motion was equated for here between the seated and lying leg curl. And so this study is also in support of the idea that if you're looking for a good exercise for hypertrophy, the stretch is a big thing you should be looking for. To round off the direct comparisons, we have two more studies. Both of these studies compared the bicep curl with dumbbells to different back exercises. One of them compared to the pull-down exercise. When they measured bicep hypertrophy at only one site, they found similar bicep hypertrophy from the pull-down to the dumbbell curl. And so the pull-down seems like a decent option to grow the biceps. Conversely, when another study compared the bicep curl to an underhand dumbbell row, they found around twice as much hypertrophy from the dumbbell curl compared to the underhand dumbbell row. And so certain back movements may be a little bit better when it comes to stimulating hypertrophy of the biceps than others. Specifically, it might be the case, based on only these two studies, so it is very preliminary, but it might be the case that vertical pulling is better for your biceps compared to horizontal pulling. And that about wraps it up for all of the direct studies we have comparing different exercises. So, based on this research, could you go and write a program using only the most effective exercises from direct comparisons of different exercises in the studies? No. For instance, if you wanted to grow your abs, we don't have any research to my knowledge comparing the effectiveness of different ab exercises and actually measuring ab hypertrophy. So instead, you're going to have to rely to some extent on these generalizable principles that seem to emerge if you look at these studies together in combination. So what other principles can we arrive at from the research? Well, for one, we have a couple of meta-analyses comparing machine versus free weight exercises, finding that they're basically the same for hypertrophy. So just because a movement is machine-based or free weight-based doesn't make it any better inherently. Similarly, a meta-analysis of single versus multi-joint training found similar hypertrophy whether you're doing compound movements only or isolation movements only or a combination. With that being said, single joint movements do have a theoretical edge in that they make it more likely that the target muscle group is the limiting factor. If you're doing something like a deadlift for quad hypertrophy, there's a lot of other things that could give out before your quads do, resulting in your quads not being taken all the way to muscular failure. However, when it comes to something like a leg extension, where the quads are the only muscles capable of extending your knee, if you take the set to failure, your quads will be at failure as well. And so generally, on principle, more isolation movements are going to be preferable for individual muscle groups. And importantly, my whole PhD was on the effects of range of motion during training on hypertrophy and strength. And one of the findings I've kept coming back to throughout this video and these comparisons of different exercises is that getting a deep stretch in the target muscle group under tension is important when it comes to selecting the right exercise for hypertrophy. Without further ado, let me break down what I think the principles for exercise selection are based on all of this research. First, like I just mentioned, a really good hypertrophy exercise will have the target muscle group placed in a stretch position, placed under plenty of tension in a stretch position, and the exercise will allow you to safely do lengthened partials. For example, on a free weight squat, you may not want to do partials in the stretch position. However, on something like a leg press, you might be able to do so more safely. Next, whatever exercise you pick should target one of the functions of the target muscle group. To go back to the Biarticular study, if all you did was skullcrushers, you would never actually grow your chest by very much, because the skullcrusher doesn't target one of the functions of the pecs. And ideally, across your whole exercise selection, you would make sure to cover a variety of functions of each muscle to make sure you're getting as much overall hypertrophy as possible. Next, as I mentioned earlier, the fewer non-target muscle limiting factors there are, or things that could essentially prevent the target muscle from being the limiting factor, the better. What this means is that if, for example, you want to pick the right exercise for the right rep range. If you do squats for sets of 20, you might find you get out of breath before your quads reach anywhere close to failure. And so the best exercise for hypertrophy is also rep range specific. But more importantly, what this means is that if you really want to grow your triceps, isolation movements are probably better than compound movements. And this was evidenced in the Biarticular study, for example, where the skullcrusher did result in better overall tricep hypertrophy by some margin than the bench press. And finally, a good hypertrophy exercise will also be reasonably stable, be reasonably loadable, so that you can get somewhere in the 5 to 50 rep range. You need to be able to add enough load to make it to within that rep range, and that's about it. To maximize muscle building, if you consider these 4 or 5 factors, you'll make excellent choices. Let me give you a few more criteria if you're pressed for time as well. First, the squat, the bench, the deadlift, and even the overhead press, as much as many people love them, myself included, they tend not to be very time efficient. For most people, it just takes a ton of time. So if you're going for muscle growth, consider exercises that are a bit more time efficient. For example, dumbbell-based, stack-loaded machines. Those tend to just be the easiest and the fastest because you don't need to set up the barbell, you don't need to load the barbell. They just tend to be a bit more time efficient, all else being equal. Similarly, bodyweight exercises are great. Next, supersettable or drop-settable exercises are phenomenal as well. We have research on antagonistic paired supersets, or essentially pairing 2 exercises with no overlap in terms of the musculature being involved, generally not compromising performance. Which, if you can superset 2 exercises and cut your training time in half and get the same stimulus, that is good news. Likewise, when it comes to drop sets, we had a meta-analysis by Coleman and colleagues comparing traditional set training to drop set training, finding similar hypertrophy, with the caveat that in the drop set training groups, they took about 50 to 70% less time to train. And so exercises, predominantly stack-loaded machine exercises, that easily allow you to drop set are great as well. On the other hand, if for example you're looking for an easy chest and back superset, consider the incline dumbbell press and the incline dumbbell row. And finally, although it's a very minor component of making an exercise more time efficient, bilateral exercises where you're training both of your limbs at the same time, for example doing a barbell squat versus a barbell split squat, the barbell squat will be a tiny bit more time efficient on account of just needing to do 1 versus 2 sets. If you want a whole video on how to make your training more time efficient, it'll be published soon, so stay tuned. That's the video. I broke down all of the research on what exercises are best for hypertrophy, both from the direct research and from generalizable principles we're able to get at from exercise science as a whole. When you're selecting your exercises for hypertrophy, consider these principles, or don't, and instead get a qualified coach to do the work for you. We have a qualified team of coaches at strongbyScience.com/coaching who would love to take care of your training, nutrition, or even just have a consultation with you to be able to answer your questions. If you're looking for similar information delivered to you for free every couple of weeks in your email inbox, check out the newsletter below. If there's anything else you'd like to see us cover over here at the Strong by Science channel, leave a comment down below and we'll get to it. That is the video. Have a fantastic day and we'll see you guys next time. Peace.